Good morning, good morning, good morning. Lots of people were requesting that I do something. I told everybody if I could find the time, I would do it to talk Houston Texans. I appreciate you guys reaching out. It's dope to feel needed or wanted. You guys have always been super dope, so I appreciate it. I know last time I came back, I caused an uproar amongst the other podcasters and YouTubers. But today will be a little bit different. So we'll hop into the Texans, the agenda, quite a bit to talk about, honestly. Haven't done a live stream on like directly through YouTube. This is the first time I've ever done that. Not the most ideal time, 10:07 on a Friday, but figured I would find a way. Anyways, Texans, Houston Texans, lots of things going on. Specifically, I guess let's start with the fact that the Texans have a franchise quarterback. I think that seems to be the thought process by a lot of fans right now. Through two games, CJ Stroud has looked a lot better. He's looked a lot better than I anticipated. I didn't expect him to come out the gates the way that he did. He looks a lot better. I do think that Bobby Slowick is doing a lot to help him. I think a lot of the complaints about the offense right now is really just the fact that Bobby is trying to really ease CJ into this situation and really build his confidence internally by giving him, not having him do too much. And I think that's totally fair. I think it's a good approach to take for a rookie quarterback. We had Deshaun come in and light the league on fire 5 years ago, however long it was, and everybody was super excited, and the wins were happening, and then he tore his ACL. I think some quarterbacks can do that. I don't think every quarterback can do that or should do that. And I think the approach the Texans are taking with CJ is a really solid approach. You really don't want to hurt his confidence. Instead, you really want to build it. And it looks like that's what they're doing. They're doing it without a run game too. The run game is abysmal. But CJ has played a lot better. I know I was an AR guy, and everybody on Twitter will they call me out if I criticize anything about CJ or anything like that. I didn't watch the second half of the game. I was at Disneyland, but against the Colts. So I know he made a lot of good throws and threw for a ton of yards, and I think everybody was ecstatic about what he did in the second half. For me, it really is like when I'm looking at like a quarterback, what did you do prior to that, right? Like, what did you do when the game meant something? I know that he was only down 11. It's still a lot of time. Is it garbage time? Is it not garbage time? I think there's I've seen some stats that show that it is garbage time. I've seen some stats that it's not garbage time. But at the end of the day, really what you want to look for in CJ is just consistent play, his ability to make the open field throws, the wide open throws. And Bobby's done a really good job of creating separation and giving CJ the ability to put the ball where it needs to go and it not be a risky throw. And you really got to credit Bobby Slowick for that. I know it's hard to do right now when you're not winning and you're 0-2 and you get destroyed by a division rival in the Colts. But I think a lot of what's happening also, there's a ton of props that need to go to Bobby Slowick. As far as like the Texans having a franchise quarterback, I think it's really hard for anybody to say through 2 weeks that CJ Stroud is that. I think CJ Stroud has shown a ton of poise, obviously with what he's dealing with too. Didn't have tons of last week. His entire starting offensive line outside of Shaq Mason is out. But ultimately, he is playing extremely well. He's playing better than everybody else. It's funny how quick everybody forgets that, Bryce Young was the quarterback everybody wanted. People were saying he is the best. He's the Peyton Manning of this draft with his mind. He's so cerebral, blah, blah, blah. Well, right now it's looking like CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson are the two quarterbacks that should have been taken one or two, however you want to look at it. And CJ's doing enough. And I think that's ultimately what you need to think about as far as what you're seeing on film. but you got to see it early on. You got to see it when the game matters, right? Can't go down 14-0, have three drives that end in 0 points. And I think the one thing that CJ has done that really is exciting, or maybe it's Bobby Slowick, or maybe it's a combination of the two. I'd probably lean towards that. Probably a combination of the two is the involvement of Nico Collins and the development of Nico Collins and the evolvement of Nico Collins. Nico looks like a dominant number one wide receiver in this offense, and CJ is looking to him early and often. Um, Always been extremely high in Nico Collins. I've always had the thought and always said this and pushed this that I think eventually he's going to get it. It always has come down to health. Last year, the first 6 games before he got hurt, he looked like a completely different wide receiver in year two. Then he got hurt. And then this year he's looking very similar. Obviously he's on a upward trajectory. I don't think many people expected him to be in, but he's a solid wide receiver, and really, it's really nice to see somebody step up to become that dominant number one, at least through 2 weeks. So props to CJ for elevating Nico, giving him balls that he can catch, placing them where they need to be, and then props to Bobby Slowick for using Nico in a way that really highlights his skill set and what he does. So it's exciting to see what Nico's done. It's exciting to see what CJ's done. I'm just not one to crown early. I don't want to crown CJ Stroud, because all that does is, like, we're 2 weeks in. We only have 2 games that have been played. Not really against top tier defenses, right? Baltimore, maybe, but not really. They were missing, their entire secondary basically. The Colts, decent defense, not a great defense. I'd like to see, what he looks like against a like Jets defense, or something like that really makes you think as a quarterback and gives you different looks that that you haven't seen or you aren't used to seeing. But through 2 weeks, CJ has looked a lot better than I expected and a lot better than most people expected. Hopefully that is just the path he continues on. But keep in mind, he's a young 22-year-old kid. He's going to have bad games. Doesn't mean he's not a franchise quarterback. It could, it's a week-to-week league. Anything can happen. But I'm not going to crown him as the franchise guy like most people are. Most people are already like, they found the franchise quarterback. Look at this. It's like, man, it's a 17-game season. You're only 2 weeks in, and this is like, you haven't won a game. Like, you haven't won a game, and you're making excuses saying it's not CJ, but like, CJ also plays a part in winning just as much as he does losing. And those first 3 drives, he didn't do anything special. So I think for anybody to crown CJ Stroud as a franchise quarterback this early in the season, I think it's a mistake. And I think you just need to temper expectations and just be happy that he's playing well. Don't hop on that. We have one. This is who it is. Like, give it time. Like, he's working things out. Bobby Slowick's working things out. The run game isn't there. The offensive line is hurt. Like, let's see what this team looks like when everybody's back. And let's see if it can become a consistent thing. Ultimately, that's all I'm looking for. And I think that's all anybody should be looking for. We're 0-2. Doesn't feel good. Play the Jags this week. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. Texans own the Jags, always have, even since Trevor Lawrence. I think Trevor Lawrence has only won 1 game out of the 4 they've played. So, this will be an interesting game on Sunday, but let's just hold off on, like, CJ is this guy. CJ is going to be that guy. We don't know yet, and that's okay. We don't need to know yet. We'll know more as the season goes on, and we'll know more when the season ends. I will say this about CJ, and I think this is one thing that doesn't really get talked about enough. At the podium, and who he seems to be as a individual, not just a football player, but just as a person. I don't know. It's really hard to not like the kid. Like, he just comes off very genuine, authentic. He comes off as a good leader. He says all the right things. That's everything that we've heard prior to the season starting too. A lot of the players were praising him, and the way he is as a leader. I think that's a big piece of being a franchise quarterback, right? Like, if we just compare it to now, obviously Deshaun now is not Deshaun in the past. And when we had Deshaun, everybody looked at Deshaun as like the greatest human being in the world. Come to find out, not the case. Could that happen? Sure. Is it likely to happen twice? Probably not. But, CJ being a good individual and a good human being that to me is probably one of the best things about having CJ Stroud as your quarterback is just the fact that you have a guy who's really dedicated to winning. I mean, he hurt his throwing shoulder, didn't practice Friday, looked like he was a game time decision, and he wanted to go out there and play with his team. He even said specifically at the home opener, like, I need to be out there with my guys and I need to be out there for the city. I think that's the type of shit that really moves people, and I think that's a really solid approach by him and his team, and hopefully that continues. Hopefully that continues. All right. Injuries are piling up. I mean, injuries are. I don't know. What was the season where we had? It was like either us or the Commanders who had like the worst injury riddled season in the history of the NFL. I think it was the Commanders and us, but this is going down a very similar path, and it's a lot of players. Like, this team doesn't have a ton of depth, so when you don't have a ton of depth and you're facing the type of injuries the Texans are facing right now, I mean, they have two starting offensive linemen active on the roster with Shaq Mason and Laramie Tunsil. Outside of that, the other three are, pieces added in the offseason or in training camp or traded at cut downs. And you got Derek Stingley out, Jalen Petrie out. You have Jimmy Ward out. He's going to make his first start this week. Tank Dell, John Mechie. Tank Dell played, but he was banged up a little bit. You lose Tavir Thomas. It's wild to think about, like, this team really has had, like, they don't have a core foundation of great players, but they do have a pretty good core foundation of good to above average players, right? Tavir Thomas, while maybe only seen as a good or great, somewhat great player, really has been a lockdown slot corner this year and has been truly amazing. Losing Derek Stingley is huge. I'm glad it seems to only be for 3 to 4 weeks. He's had a very quiet season, but that's really what you want to look for in your cornerback. He's been locked down, which is amazing. I was a big believer in Stingley over Sauce from a film perspective, but the ankle injury he had in college, now it's a hamstring. He missed last season. It's interesting to see, and I know it's bringing up the conversation, and everybody's all over Nick right now because of it. But Sauce has been toast over the last 2 weeks, and if anybody actually paid attention to last year, like, he was that too at times. He got away with a lot, but the injuries are piling up, and it's tough. It's going to be interesting to see how this team responds. It really can only go two ways. They can eke out a win against the Jags and get healthy, or the injury bug is just going to impact them, and they're not going to be able to perform at the level that they think they can. They really can't get that run game going, and I think a lot of that has to do with the offensive line. Dameon Pierce looks very similar to how he looked last year from his running style, but when there are no run lanes, it's hard for a running back to just create. If you look, like, you're still seeing the after contact, yards. He's still moving those legs forward as much as he can, but there is no push from that offensive line whatsoever. And you really can't expect a running back just to make things happen all the time. And we're going to need to see we're going to need to see Titus back. We're going to need to see everybody on the offensive line is going to need to be back. But these injuries, it's funny. You can't go to Nick or about blaming him on injuries. Like, the Stingley pick, I think you can have a conversation. Like, maybe it was a bad pick over Sauce. I think that's a conversation for sure that anybody should entertain. I think it's really hard for anybody to say that was a wrong decision. Like, injuries are pure bad luck. Yes, does strength and conditioning have a part in it? Sure. Do you honestly think that the strength and conditioning program for the Texans is that bad that we're causing all these players to be injured? Come on, man. That would be the first thing that they would evaluate through week 1 and week 2. Like, that's not even a topic of conversation at NRG. So, I don't know. I think it's just a string of bad luck. And to go after Nick Casserio for injuries, honestly, it's just dumb. It really is. It's just a dumb take. You shouldn't be talking about anything if that's the case. Like, what is he supposed to do? Like, he drafted great players. They didn't perform because they've been injured. Like, Stingley on the field has been a great corner when he's played. Unfortunately, he just hasn't played. Kenyon Green, I think the May surgery, pushing him out, ending his season. I think you can have a conversation about that. Nick has had his blunders as a general manager. I think that's totally fair. He is not without, he should be ridiculed and criticized for some of the mistakes he's made, but the injury side of it, like that's not something I can see anybody really going after a general manager for. I think it's super strange. But Nick is on the hot seat, and at least from the fans' perspective, I don't know if he's on the hot seat in the building. I'm sure D'Amico wants his own guy, but it seems to me like based on the offseason and the stories that were being told by the Texans as far as like within their own productions and stuff like that, D'Amico and Nick get along. They see football very similarly. They have a great relationship. They talk all the time. There seems to be no issue between the two. I think this is just a bad luck season so far through 2 weeks. And if that continues, like who knows? It is a result-oriented business. If there are no wins, like what do you do? But like if there's no wins, it can't all fall on Nick. Like eventually you're going to have to hold the hometown hero D'Amico Ryans available or accountable as well. Like, look, the storyline is past. The season is here. The season's here. Like that great bring back the all-star player that has ties to Houston, that storyline is gone. That doesn't matter anymore. At least to me. Like I thought it was a great offseason feeling. Everything that you wanted, it gave you all the positive storylines, really looked like the Texans were on the right path. All of that. That's all great. All good shit. All great content. All great things, right? Gives the fans tons to talk about, gives them a ton of reason to be positive. At the end of the day, it comes down to winning. It comes down to nothing else. D'Amico has to win. D'Amico has to put a good product on the field. He hasn't so far. Just to be clear, like he hasn't. The first week with the timeout issues and the plays being, not executed on time or called in on time, or CJ didn't understand it. I think, you know, there's a ton of things that we haven't seen so far from D'Amico. It's okay to criticize him and still believe in him, right? I do think D'Amico is going to be a good head coach. I think he could be a great head coach. But right now we're not seeing that. We're not seeing what we thought we would see or what we think we should see. And I think the expectations are starting to drop a little bit more and more. All can turn around with a win. It's just the way the league works. It's the way the fan base works. You're down on a loss, you're up on a win. It's an emotional game. But through 2 weeks, D'Amico hasn't done anything or shown anything that makes me think this guy is exactly what we thought he was. The product hasn't matched everything we were told in the offseason. And he's got to get some dubs. That's all it boils down to. He really needs to get this team playing. But I mean, he's doing, also then you got to take in injuries, right? Like there's just so many pieces that go into this. He can't help injuries either. But if you coach up players, right, like those backups and the depth should be able to come in and fill a role. But it's interesting. Like I think that storyline just needs to be like, I'm just not worried about that storyline anymore. I think it's a very lazy storyline at this point. Like it's all about results. We need to win. This team's been shit for the past 4 years. The organization was on fire for 4 years. Like there's no excuse now. You not wasted. Wasted is a terrible word. You allocated a ton of draft picks to this team, a total of 4 so far. You technically, actually 5. You traded 1 for Will Anderson, which I do believe it was the right move. Will looks good. He didn't look solid on Sunday. I'm sure the game plan for the Colts was to take him out because who else is really a threat on the defensive line for the Houston Texans? Grenard was quiet too. But when you make that move, when you draft the quarterback at 2 and you give up a future first and a second to move up to 3 to grab Will Anderson and find your cornerstone on defense and your cornerstone on offense, expectations have started. Like everybody can say, oh, well, you're 3 to 4 years away. Well, if that's the case, then you shouldn't have given up so much draft capital, right? If this team's 3 to 4 years away, that means that you're wasting 4 years of CJ Stroud's rookie contract, probably the most valuable contract in all of sports. You're also wasting the first 3 to 4 years of Will Anderson's contract. If he ends up being a stud, you're going to have to re-sign him long term. Like there are things that are happening that need to change. Like this team has to win. You went into win now mode when you made those moves. Maybe you have a season, but after that, like that clock has really started. I think the clock started this year. But if it hasn't started this year for everybody, then it needs to start next year. Like this can't be something that's continued to be pushed out every year, right? Also, the other thing I keep saying, which just it's super stupid to me, is Nick should be fired for just giving up the Texans pick instead of the Browns pick for Will Anderson to move up to 3. You guys do realize like negotiating happens on both sides, right? The Arizona Cardinals GM had a offer that he had for him to accept that trade proposal, and that offer could have easily been the Texans' first round pick next year instead of the Browns. Like it takes two parties. Now, Nick had a choice in saying, I decline and I'm not going to go get Will Anderson. But obviously he didn't do that. Him and D'Amico believed in Will and the value that he's going to provide this team long term. So they gave up the Texans first round pick next year. But I think it's interesting. Like it's pretty stupid to just think like, oh, Nick gave up. Like you think Nick just called the general manager of the Cardinals and was like, here's what I'm going to give you. Blah. Like, I don't know. His negotiating seems to be pretty good when it comes to trades. Like he doesn't give up a ton of draft capital. Like I think the first year he gave up whatever it was like a third round pick for somebody. But other than that, like it's really hard for me to believe he just called what's his name, Steve Keim or whoever it is at the Cardinals and just was like, boom, we're going to give you this, and this. What do you think? Like negotiating doesn't start that way. It's like, hey, what's your price to move up for us to move up to 3? Well, here's what I'm thinking. Well, we really can't meet that. Here's what we got, blah, blah, blah. They go back and forth. Then finally a trade is struck and agreed upon. But I think it's stupid to blame Casserio for giving that up. That must have been a backbone or like the true value for the Cardinals to make that trade was probably getting the Texans first round pick next year. We still don't know what the Browns pick will be. It could easily be. We're only 2 weeks in, so it could very easily change to the point to where the Browns pick is a better pick than the Texans pick. Who knows? Browns are only 1-1. Deshaun Watson looks like pure shit. The Browns don't look like a good team. They don't look like they're good, like highly or well coached. And I think everybody just kind of needs to chill. Let's get to the midpoint of the season before we start having these conversations. Like, let's enjoy the games. Let's enjoy the season. There's good football being played outside of NRG. Like, enjoy those games. But outside of that, like, let's just take a step back for a minute. All right. So with that being said, trying to think of what else that's really been going on. Bryce Young. Yeah, he looks eh. I think that's a funny thing, to be honest with you. I think it's strange that people didn't think that a guy his frame, his size would last in the NFL. Like people would make every excuse possible during the offseason on like why that would work. And like it's not this, it's not that. Like he's going to be totally healthy and fine and da. And like we're entering week 3, he's not playing because he's been getting his ass beat. Even had to be pushed over by his running back to line up properly. But he's supposed to be like this cerebral guy. I think that's the funniest storyline is the fans backing away from Bryce Young. And now it's like, oh, we were all in on CJ Stroud. Like, no, you weren't. You weren't. Nobody was. That's the interesting piece. You know what's so funny is if CJ Stroud ends up being the quarterback of this draft class, it would literally go into every single like every other draft that has happened. It's the guy nobody talks about. Right. Bryce Young was talked about. Anthony Richardson was talked about a ton. CJ not talked about too much. Also, destroyed by the S2 and like any cognitive aspect and his mental and all of this. Like him being the best quarterback out of this draft class is just too funny. It just shows that it's like a really hard position to evaluate and multiple people got it wrong. Right. Thank God the Panthers traded up to take Bryce Young because if they would have took CJ Stroud, this would have been a completely different situation. Who has more durability issues, BY or AR? I would say BY because AR's issue is the fact that he is not safe when running the ball. He's not protecting his body. He's not protecting his head. That for me is enough to think that he will be more durable. It's something he can learn, right? With Bryce, it's not something he can learn. He can't change his frame. He can't change his body. AR can change the way he runs. He can slide more. He can not run as much. Like he's also built like a Greek god. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It's too early to say that. Like it's only 2 weeks in. He's Andrew Lucking himself. Like that offensive line isn't great either. And if anything, like Shane Steichen, well, a great play caller and looks like a pretty good coach. Like he's not doing any service to AR either. Like this guy you just drafted, like don't run him into the ground. Like let him learn. I think the funny part about AR is everybody was saying this guy can't make the 5, 6, 7 yard throws. He's not accurate, and that's pretty much how he killed the Texans on the first 2 drives. But yeah, all right. With that being said, I don't really have anything else. Glad I can get you guys something. I'll try to put this up as a podcast. You guys rock. I don't know if I'll do this again. Been pretty busy, but if I have time, if I find myself at 20 to 30 minutes, I might throw something up there. But I appreciate you guys rocking with me. Appreciate you guys tuning in. And with that being said, I'm Young Ari Gold signing off for Texans Unfiltered. I'll catch you when I catch you.